I'd like to welcome everyone and again thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit about my experience um, supporting both the faculty of nursing around equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as developing research that brings diverse perspectives into health. As I've been introduced, my name is 𝐒𝐂𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁𝐄. I use the pronouns he and they, and I'm a proud 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐄 or Two-Spirit Métis person and registered nurse. I do want to acknowledge that my academic work and much of which informs this presentation has been graciously supported by the Canadian Institute of Health Research, the Canadian Nurses Foundation, the Alberta Indigenous Mentorship Health Innovation Program, ARNET, the Alberta Registered Nurses Trust, Educational Trust, in collaboration with Inspire and the Canadian Immunization Research Network. I also want to acknowledge that I work with the U of A in the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the faculty, and I'm a board member here of the Pain Society of Alberta, just to sort of position where I am and how these things sort of inform my work. My email's up there too if you have any questions after. I do want to start just by sharing some photo of the lands I grew up on and also where I live now. So I grew up in the traditional territories of the Dene, 𝐒𝐂𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁𝐄 or 𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁𝐄 in the homeland of the Métis Nation, and what is part of the lands that are agreed to be shared up in Treaty 8. These lands and peoples influenced the way I grew up. In many ways. I subsequently moved to Edmonton, also known as 𝐒𝐂𝐄𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁𝐄 or Beaver Hills House in 𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁𝐄, where I'm joining you from now, which is a traditional gathering place, traveling route, and the home of many Indigenous peoples, including 𝐒𝐂𝐂𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁𝐄, Cree, Tsuut'ina, Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Dene, Tsuut'ina, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Papas-Chase, and Inuit, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation, which I'm a citizen. These lands were agreed to be shared in Treaty 6, which also contains the extremely important Medicine Chest Clause, which was signed in 1876, that outlines the obligations of the Crown to provide Western health solutions for Indigenous peoples in times of need, while honoring the traditional healing practices of First Nations signatories. And I'm so grateful for my co-presenters who've brought their lenses of Indigenous knowledge to this work. I think it's so important that we begin to center those traditional Indigenous healing ways in order to advance healing and reconciliation. The picture down in the bottom right is of the recent northern lights over Edmonton during a solar storm that was occurring. And I really thought that if anyone got a chance to see them, they were incredibly beautiful. So I just wanted to share. I'm here to talk a little bit about traditional and different ways of approaching pain research. Traditional research methodologies coming from sort of a positivist lens attempt to remove the personal from the process. There's been a historical goal of achieving objectivity, which has dominated the fields of medical science for hundreds of years. Here's a couple of wonderful papers that outline different approaches to managing chronic pain, one examining complex cellular and molecular processes of chemokines in chronic pain, another one looking at CBD extracts on opioid use and quality of life in people living with chronic pain. But what's interesting is that both of these studies adhere to very strict measures of statistical reliability and validity, and absolutely contribute to what's known about managing chronic pain. But both studies excluded patients or participants in their research based on a variety of factors that have likely altered the quality of their results or potentially were unethical due to exposure. And both studies failed to look at differences between subjects included in their studies. Things like socioeconomic status, skin color, sexuality, gender, levels of education, and many of those social determinants of health that we've already heard about. These are very good studies, but they could be better. Today, I want to talk with you about ways in which we might embrace the broad diversity of human experience in the ways in which we do pain research and practice pain science knowledge translation in the ways that we work. As we all know, we all experience the world very differently. And Marnie talked a lot about unconscious bias, which I think is such an important piece of what I'm going to talk about as well. We all experience the world very differently. However, the degree to which our experiences differ from others is very complex and heavily socially determined. Here are some questions on the screen that I think we all likely reflect on at different points in our lives. I know I certainly have. They can be sources of pride or shame or even indifference. We might adjust the way we look or behave in response to asking ourselves these types of questions. But in today's talk, I'm going to challenge us all to think about how we might make our work, our research, and our lives more meaningful by making them more inclusive. Positionality is rooted theoretically in the fields of critical race theory and critical feminism, but it has been applied broadly in a number of areas of research, including education, social sciences, nursing, Indigenous studies, many, many more. Unlike the cartoon here, positionality asks us to reject the idea that science can be a one-size-fits-all. It asks us to account for the incredible and beautiful diversity that exists in the world and reflect on our own experiences, our heritage, our biases, ideologies, beliefs, and relationships as part of the research or practice that we're engaged in. It challenges us to reject the idea of color, culture, or gender blindness and embrace those differences that exist and inform our perspectives in a really critical way. And when I say critical, I don't mean like the negative sort of like, oh, you're so critical, you know, that doesn't fit properly. I mean critical in the way that we think through it in a very critical way, asking hard questions to try and understand those unconscious or unresolved biases that we might have. Milner, a researcher in social science and education, in 2018 wrote a brilliant piece of educational research that explored the ways in which we might incorporate positionality into our work. Milner suggests that by critically reflecting on questions like the ones posted here, we might begin the difficult task of positioning ourselves in relation to our students, our peers, our patients, other healthcare providers. It begins with questioning yourself. What is your heritage? What is your gender? How do you see yourself in terms of sexual orientation or ability or disability? And how do you know those things about yourself? Marnie talked a lot about those critical reflections to try and uncover biases. And I think Milner just takes it to that next level by providing a framework to do that important self-reflection. It asks that we reflect on how our backgrounds, histories, and beliefs about ourselves influence our work. And how do we negotiate these things in our practice? How do we know how these things impact the way in which we work? They challenge us to closely examine our own beliefs about diversity, our knowledge of history, and how we came to know these things. Did we learn about Indigenous history in school? Were the textbooks and information sources that we were given written by Indigenous people or settlers, colonizers? Whose narrative was given to us? Did we learn about it from our parents? Who taught them? These are the questions that we want to ask to start to unpick some of those pieces around social position and context that can be really useful. It's personal work, but by engaging in those self-reflective practices, either on your own or with a trusted loved one, or a trusted colleague or friend, we can start to unpick and extricate some of those unconscious and conscious biases that we have from our work. This last question about our personal experiences always gets me, because growing up queer in a small northern community in Alberta, many of my own personal beliefs about homophobia, transphobia, and their relationships with violence were informed from my own very personal experiences. It wasn't until I looked more closely at these that I was able to begin that important work of rebuilding my relationships and trust in others and to live a more authentic life. I promise you it's a work in progress. I'm continually having to decolonize the way I think about my own gender and sexuality on a daily basis. But that important work helps me to relate better with people from across the gender and sexuality spectrums, because knowing who I am and where I stand and being proud and happy about those things gives permission for other people to do that work as well. Milner also asked that we apply a similar set of questions to the subjects of our own work, practice, or research. And again, to question how you come to know these things. It really challenges us to relate to others in different and curious ways. And Marnie talked about curiosity as being an important piece of this. These questions ask us to challenge what we think we know and to inquire in ways that are more open and accepting of others. Including diversity of views, experiences, and all those other things that make us unique and wonderful. Now, it's essential to engage in these reflective processes both regularly, but also especially at the conception, design, and implementation stages of any work that we're doing. Structure can be really useful. And so knowing that you want to put some of these reflective questions at the beginning, middle, and end of anything that you're doing can be really helpful. I'm sharing some images here of people I look up to, and I look to for inspiration to work in often challenging systems that seek to erase the many differences that we have. And I find that very common in medical research. I highly recommend you look them up, but both of these brilliant and diverse humans have stood up when others would have them sit and have subsequently changed the world. On the top there, that picture is Elder Roy Bearchief, a residential school survivor and Blackfoot language and culture preservation activist that I work with closely at the University of Calgary, and who's provided me with untold mentorship and, Blackfoot words and, his ability to work within and against systems that have continually tried to strip him of his culture is absolutely incredible. And he continues to influence thousands of students every year. Below, Marsha P. Johnson, an American gender and sexuality activist who was involved with the Stonewall riots. She's a Black trans person whose, iconic work has led to many of the freedoms and legislative and policy changes that have led to improved equality for queer and trans folks across North America or Turtle Island. Now I want to shift gears a little bit. We've talked about positionality. Now I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality and health. I think this video does it better justice than I can, so I'm going to share this video with you from the University of Sheffield. All right, let's see how this is going to work. Oh, sorry about that. Good. Apologies, technical difficulties. There we go.
Research has shown us that gender, ethnicity, and social class have a strong impact on our health. Yet the simple fact is that no one is just a man or woman, or just black or white, or just working class or middle class. But instead, we have multiple characteristics that shape our lives. Instead, imagine a population represented on a grid. About half the population is female, half male, and some non-binary. And say 80% are white, and 20% are minority ethnic, and these groups have different social class backgrounds. Now we can ask, do these different resulting subgroups have different levels of health and disease? And if so, how can we explain these differences? Enter a perspective called intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term to describe the discrimination experienced by Black women. She gave the example of a lawsuit against General Motors for not hiring Black women. The company hired women and Black people, but did not hire Black women in particular. Crenshaw showed how sexism and racism combine to create a distinct type of disadvantage. This could be extended to other types of isms, such as ageism, disableism, and classism. Together, these different types of discrimination result in varying forms of advantage and disadvantage, which can lead to differences in health. To understand why discrimination is important for health, it's useful to think of the role of social institutions such as schools, hospitals, or the legal system. These institutions control who enters them and the experiences that they have there. Working-class children are underrepresented among university students, and Black men are overrepresented in prison. Discrimination in the criminal justice system, the education system, and in society more widely is a key reason why we see such differences. In fact, any social institution, like employment or housing, can unfairly discriminate on the basis of multiple social characteristics. We know that social institutions are key determinants of health, and this helps to explain health differences based on gender, ethnicity, and other social characteristics. However, we do need to be careful and remember that people are hugely diverse. For example, white middle-class men are on average healthier than, say, black working-class women, but there is still lots of overlap between these two groups. This overlap is also important to keep in mind because experiences of sexism can unite all women, regardless of their ethnicity and social background. Racism, ageism, and other isms can also unite people to bring about social change. Yet, as 𝐒𝐁𝐄 showed, if we do not consider intersectionality, we may miss how interlocking forms of discrimination create new inequalities. So far, researchers and public health professionals have paid little attention to intersectionality. There has often been an assumption that one size fits all, and discrimination is rarely seen as an explanation of health differences. Yet we are now starting to see signs that more and more intersectionality is being taken seriously. To find out more about how you can incorporate intersectionality in your own work, please follow the links we have posted below.
Thank you. So those links are available at the end of the presentation. And yeah, so that video in a nutshell covers a ton of the stuff that I have difficulty articulating when I write for my research projects. But basically, it's a messy process of comparing variables and including variables that are often not considered in research. I remember I was at a conference and someone was presenting mental health experiences of adolescents with sexually transmitted infections was the title of the talk. And then when they were going through their talk, they said that they had excluded LGBTQI2S+ participants in their research. So, at the end of the presentation, I just gently put up my hand and I said, your title's a little bit misleading because it's really only talking about the mental health of cisgender heterosexual adolescents who experience sexual health problems. And so, there's that overgeneralization or of wanting to make work generalizable, but then excluding potentially marginalized groups. So it's an important piece of work to start to incorporate intersectionality into that. Now I'm going to talk a tiny bit about relationality, and my colleague already mentioned it. 𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁 is the natural law of relationality. It's this idea that we're all related, and this is a Métis kinship thing, but it also comes from many other First Nations experiences. And these natural laws of kinship ask us to consider all of those people and things that we encounter as relatives. Marnie touched on this as well, like treating people the way they wish to be treated. This idea invites us to consider the vast diversity of the world as close or distant relatives, but that we still have those obligations or responsibilities as kin to one another. It can be a powerful way of transforming the way we work. If you think of your patient, your colleague, your doctor, your physiotherapist, whoever it is you're interacting with, as potentially being a relative. And it shifts that relationship in a totally different way to one where you do feel a higher sense of empathy and a want to relate to them in a different way. Combining these ideas, such as 𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁 or relationality, with positionality and intersectionality can radically change the way that we work. I like to also use the lens of storytelling. There we go. We can critically examine the way we work and interact with everyone, including places and non-human things in our lives. We can start to restory those relationships that we have. This image from the Gabriel Dumont Institute shows a grandmother telling stories to Métis youth. These stories would shape the future views of those young minds. And just like Marnie mentioned with the difficult patient, these stories start to shape the unconscious biases that will inform future generations. These young people may share those stories again with their own twist added to them. And I'd encourage you to consider these questions that I've posted, to think about how we might look at our own stories. What are the frames and stories that we've been told? What are the stories that we've constructed from our own personal experiences? How might we critically examine those stories and retell them in different, new, or positive ways? A good example of this restoring I learned when I was developing my recovery orientation working in mental health. We were critically examining the charting of behaviors of people who were labeled with psychiatric diagnoses of personality disorder. And often staff would write in the notes that patients were being manipulative with staff or other patients, and that there would be consequences for this behavior. And it was, coming up frequently. When we sat down and were thinking through those behaviors, through a recovery lens and talking with the people who had lived experiences of having those things written about them, we learned that those skills of utilizing relationships and words, and sometimes using other people's words or actions to get what one wanted, were skills that they learned early in their lives in order to have their needs met. Talking through some of those childhood experiences that led them to develop those skills, we restoried manipulative behavior as resourcefulness, adaptability, being goal-oriented. When people in care would demonstrate these skills, we would talk about them in that way and identify ways in which those skills were useful or not in the given situation, and whether or not they led to the person's goals. If the behaviors were no longer useful or the goals weren't being attained in a good way, then we'd talk with those patients about developing alternate skills or strategies to have their needs met. And what it did is shift that relationship between the nurse and the person receiving care from that problematic patient who's always being manipulative to that person who had, some adverse childhood experiences that taught them that this was a way of getting their needs met. And by shifting that narrative to one of resourcefulness and strengths-based approaches, it completely shifted the way that both the people in care and the people providing care experience those interactions. So how can we invite inclusive excellence in pain science? We want to highlight work that centers diverse views, approaches, and stories. We want to read broadly and beyond your homeland and the dominant narratives, most of which in science are Eurocentric, and share that work that you've discovered. So when you're doing a Google Scholar search or you're doing a lit review, look for papers that aren't written in English and see if there are translations. Look for papers from countries that are outside of, developed nations. And look for those papers that bring diverse views to the research that you're doing. I look at so many meta-analyses where they only looked at papers that were published in English. And you have to wonder how many papers are published in Spanish, in German, in other languages that would provide valuable contributions to these like gold standard meta-analysis that we use to make clinical decisions. We'd also ask that you ask yourselves and others to reflect critically on the questions and perspectives presented, and then position yourself in that work. Apply that lens of intersectionality to yourself, the people you care or do research with, and your service providers or researchers if you're a person living with pain. Think about diversity and inclusivity in recruiting, representing, and reporting your work, whether it's practice or research. Does your recruitment process clearly invite diversity? Is there a statement on your poster that says we invite gender diverse people with different abilities, different backgrounds? Is that very explicit in your recruitment materials? And then in your own team of workmates, does your team reflect the diversity of the communities that they serve? And is that something that needs to be addressed? And then finally, when you're reporting results, do you report both inclusion and exclusion criteria? in the results of your work in meaningful ways that honor that diversity or lack thereof in your participants. It's okay in the limitations section to identify that your exclusion criteria was a limitation to your study because it makes it less generalizable, things like that. Here I've highlighted some researchers who are interested in diversity in pain research: Barley and Fillingham, 𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁𝐄, Derwecki and 𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁𝐄, Abdi El-Sayed and Fiada all took diverse and situated approaches to exploring pain in their research. While none of these papers are perfect, they are all excellent examples of pain research that has made the choice to extend beyond randomized controlled trials and statistical methods that are exclusionary, and to explore the socially situated data that exists and produce work that highlights the complexity of the world in which we find ourselves. I think it's important to note that this work is messy and difficult to do. Lord knows I've spent many an hour working on my PhD proposal to try and capture all the elements that I want to include in my research. But the reward of extending that knowledge and care in ways that are meaningful and improve the outcomes for others is definitely worth it. There are courses and resources available from the Canadian Institute for Health Research and other excellent sources. There's a list at the end of my presentation to learn these ways of working. We have to make the effort to find them and then show up and do that work. I'm going to close with this beautiful picture of also northern Alberta taken from a helicopter. And it's just, you know, that beautiful boreal forest with the different types of trees and landscapes. And it really speaks to me about how we can, again, as my colleague mentioned, learn from the land. All of these things are present around us. There's some further reading and some image sources, and that is all I have presented.